file. And in this index.html file, I will create a brand new HTML skeleton by entering an exclamation mark, and then in this auto overlay which I get here, I hit tab to automatically create this skeleton. And here I'll just give this a title of JavaScript intro. Production. And now for the moment, we actually won't add any meaningful HTML content. Instead, for the moment, I just want to start with some JavaScript code and how we can include it in our HTML file. And that's actually the first thing I want to do. How can we now add JavaScript code to this project here, to this HTML page? Now, there are different ways of doing it, but the most straightforward and easiest way of adding JavaScript to a HTML file is to add a special script HTML element. Opening and closing. You need both tags. This is not a self-closing tag. And it's not a self-closing tag because there is content which you can put between those tags. And that content would be the actual JavaScript code. So that's very similar to the style tags we learned about earlier in the course, where we put CSS code between those tags. Now we have the script tags, and we put JavaScript code between those tags. Quite straightforward. Script code between those tags. Now we have the script tags, and we put it in the course, where we... So that's very similar to the style tags we learned about earlier in the course, where we put CSS code between those tags. Now we have the script tags, and we put JavaScript code between those tags. Quite straightforward. Now when it comes to the placement of that script element, it's basically up to you. For the style tags, I strongly recommend it that you put those into the head section. For JavaScript, I basically have the same recommendation, but you will also quite frequently see it being added in the body. It's up to you, but it is worth mentioning and highlighting that, like style, script won't render anything visible on the screen. So putting it into the body doesn't make a lot of sense from that perspective. And hence here, I'll actually also put it into the head section. Now, between those script tags, as I mentioned, we can write some JavaScript code. And to get started, let's practice working with variables and values. Now we learned that there are different values, strings and numbers for the moment, and hence let's start with these values. A string value is always created in JavaScript code by using quotes. Double quotes, opening and closing, or single quotes. So these are always created in JavaScript code by using quotes. Double quotes, opening and closing, or single quotes. So these are two individual single quotes. It's up to you. You can use either of the two, you just should be consistent If you prefer double quotes, use them in all your JavaScript code and don't switch between double and single quotes. Now, why do we need those quotes? Those quotes, double or single, doesn't matter, act as delimiters to JavaScript and to the browser, therefore, which is the thing executing our code in the end. They tell JavaScript where our text starts and where it ends. Now here I will go with single quotes since this is my personal preference, but it is up to you. And here we could now store some value. For example, hi, my name is Max. Very important, if you want to use a single quote here in the text and you're using single quotes for delimiting that text, or if you use double quotes and you want to use a double quote in the text, that won't be possible like this. You have to escape that character instead. So if I want to say hi, I'm Max, that would be invalid, as you can tell already by the fact that my IDE is showing an error, and we have to escape this character, so we have to tell JavaScript that it should not treat it as a closing quote by adding a backward slash in front of it. That's some special syntax which is worth knowing when you work with strings, because that's how you can add the quote character inside of a string. Because the quotes around the text are actually not part of the text, but instead delimit the text. They tell JavaScript where your string starts and ends. But with that, we now did create a first string. And we can also create a number. Maybe in a new line, we can add 32 as a number. And for numbers, we don't have quotes around them, we just enter the number like this. Now, you might be thinking, okay, what's the idea behind all of that? What does this code do? Well, that's the problem. This code doesn't do anything, because we're not giving the browser any useful instructions. We are just creating two values here, but we're not doing anything with those values. Now, what could we do with those values? Well, for a start, we could output them. We could output them such that we see them in some way on the loaded page. And one way of outputting a value is to actually wrap that text here maybe with a so-called function. I'll come back to functions later. You can forget the term for now, because for the moment it's enough if you just type along. You can write alert here, and then an opening bracket, opening parentheses, and after the text a closing bracket, a closing parentheses. And then this actually will send the instruction to the browser. Alert is a built-in instruction which the browser understands, which actually tells the browser to show a certain alert overlay on the screen and to show this text inside of that overlay. If you now save this HTML file and you open this with that live server extension, you should see Hi, I'm Max on that screen. You should get this overlay. And you get this overlay because of JavaScript. This is our first, at least a bit useful JavaScript instruction. And we're doing something with that text value now. We are sending it as an alert to the browser. Now, as you can imagine, there are more things that we can do than just showing alerts. We can send behind-the-scenes requests to some server, we can set timers, we can of course also manipulate the HTML code that's visible on the page if we had any. But we're going to dive into those features step by step. But now we at least have a first example of what we can do. But with that, we're still not doing anything with that number. This 32 value still just sits there and does nothing. Now, of course, we can also show this with an alert if we want to, like that. Also, again, execute this alert command here, and then wrap this between brackets, this number. And that's important. Alert works with both text and a number, as you can see. If I save this and I reload, I get hi IMAX, and if I click OK, I get this 32 value. And if I click OK again, that's gone. So now we're sending 2 alerts to the browser. And that's how we can work with values and what we can generally do with JavaScript. What we don't see here, though, are variables. Now, I mentioned that variables would be labeled data containers, which allow us to save values so that we can use them later in a different line of code, basically, or possibly also multiple times. And to show you the idea behind variables, let's say we want to output the same alert with the same text again. This all doesn't make too much sense, but we're just getting started here. Now, of course, we can copy and paste this code line as I'm doing it here. If we do that, and I reload this page, I get hi IMAX, and then I get this again, and then I get the alert with the number, because that's the order of alerts we're defining here. But this approach, besides the fact that it's not doing too many useful things, has one major downside. I'm basically copy and pasting this text here. And that means that if I want to output something else, let's say I want to say hi IMAX with multiple exclamation marks, I have to update it in 2 places. And for this simple example here, that's of course not too difficult or too bad to do, but it's also a bit redundant. That's where a variable could help us. What if we could save this text in a variable and then just reuse that variable for both alerts? Then if we want to change that value, we just have to do it in one place, in that variable, instead of in multiple places. And therefore we can now add a new feature, a new line of code to our script here. We can add a variable. And we do this with a special keyword in JavaScript. JavaScript is all about special keywords that give certain instructions to the browser. We saw one keyword, one instruction here, the alert instruction, which told the browser to show an alert. Now that actually was an instruction that caused something that we can see. There also are instructions which we can't directly see as a visitor of the page. And one instruction that we can't see as a visitor would be that we tell the browser to create a variable. And we do this with the let keyword. Now, unlike alert, let is not used like this with brackets, but instead you type let and then a blank, and then you choose the label, the name of your variable, because let is actually a keyword that tells the browser to create a variable, and every variable needs a name. So here this name is up to you, and we could use greeting text as a variable name here. One word about the name though. It is up to you, but it has to follow certain rules. Most importantly, it has to be one word which basically does not use any special characters. There are some allowed characters like a $sign, but most characters are not allowed. Especially dashes or forward slashes or colons and so on, that's all not allowed. So this must not be greeting text with a dash or anything like that. An underscore would be fine, but the convention for naming variables in JavaScript is actually to use this notation, where your word starts with a lowercase character, and if it includes other words where you normally would have a blank or anything like this, which is not allowed, those subwords start with an uppercase character. This notation is called camel case. That's just a name developers gave it, and that's the naming convention you should follow when naming your variables in JavaScript. Now, the actual content of that name is up to you. It should describe the kind of value you will be storing. And in this case, I plan on storing this text, which we could say is a greeting text, and hence I chose this name following this camel case convention. Now that creates a variable and gives it a name. One important thing is missing though, we're not assigning a value. And we can but don't have to do this in the same line with an equal sign. As I said, you don't have to do this. Alternatively, you can also do it in a new line by repeating that variable name, now without the let though. You only use this when you first introduce a variable. Once you did introduce it, you can always assign a value in any other line of code by repeating that variable name and adding an equal sign. But you can also do this in one step like this, and now just copy your value and add this here. And now we created our first variable, which we gave a name of our choice and into which we stored a value. And now that this variable is created, we can use it in other parts of our code. For example, we can use it here for these two alerts. And for that, we just use that variable name, and we replace our strings here with that variable name. And with that, we're telling the browser to send an alert or to show an alert, and to show an alert with the value that is stored in that variable. So we won't show greeting text as a text in the alert, but instead the text stored in that greeting text variable. That's the idea behind variables. We can now reuse that stored value in different places. We can also assign a new value if we want to, because it's called variable, because it's flexible. We can overwrite the value stored in there. We could say, hi, I am really Max. And now I'm overriding the value stored in greeting text with a brand new value. Again, without the let keyword here, so we don't have that, because I'm not creating a new variable. Instead, I'm assigning a new value to an existing variable. And now if I would again alert this and show the greeting text here, after assigning a new value, we should see the initial value twice, and then that new value once, before we then see that alert with 32 again. And the reason for that simply is that all your JavaScript code is executed top to bottom, left to right. That's how it always works. It's executed line after line, step by step, and if you alert a variable with a value, and then you change that value in a line thereafter, the first alert still uses the initial value, because at this point of time, when code execution reaches this line, the value has not been changed yet. But in subsequent alerts, after we changed the value stored in the variable, we will of course output that new value, because again, it's executed top to bottom, so that change in the variable value will have an impact on that alert which we execute thereafter, not on the alerts before. That should hopefully make a lot of sense. And hence, if I save that and reload, I get hi, I'm Max twice, then I get this new text, and then I get 32. And again, this is still a very made up example to introduce those basics, but that is how you work with values and variables. Now, before we dig deeper into variables and different values and what we can do, let's talk about the general syntax of all of that again. You learned about some important syntax features and rules already. For example, that there must be a white space after let, and that let is a special keyword in JavaScript, which we can use to instruct the browser to create a variable. We learned that we then can store a value with help of the equal sign in that variable, and very important for that variable name, that it must not contain any blanks or special characters, and that we therefore typically use this convention for giving it a name. The difference between a rule and a convention is that a convention is not a must-do, a rule on the other hand is. So it's a rule to not have blanks, but a convention to then use this camel case notation for assigning that name. You could also set it to greeting text like this, starting with a capital G. That would be valid. It would not violate any rules, but it would be against this convention. So that's why I'm following it with a lowercase g. Now, another syntax feature, which you will see in a lot of JavaScript code, including my JavaScript code from now on, is that lines end with a semicolon. It's actually not a must do, as you can clearly tell by the fact that this code worked without issues. But it is something which is often done. It's done to clearly mark where a line of code ends. Now, of course, you could say, well, obviously the line ends where it ends, but theoretically, in JavaScript you are allowed to have multiple commands in one line. But without a semicolon, you would get an error, as you can tell. If I add a semicolon here, that would work again. Now, it's not considered a good practice to put multiple instructions into one line though. And therefore you typically should split them across multiple lines, and hence you can omit semicolons. Nonetheless, since we must use semicolons in many other programming languages, and since we must use them in JavaScript if we had multiple instructions in the same line, it's often seen that people do use semicolons after every line, even if they do split their code across multiple lines correctly. And it's also something, a certain programming style, which I like to follow, and therefore I also put semicolons at the end of each line, but it's technically not required, and you don't have to do it, but if you don't do it, you should never do it. So again, be consistent, just as with the quotes. You can create strings with double or single quotes around them, but you should be consistent once you made a decision. And here I will be consistent, and I will be using semicolons at the end of every code line. Now that we covered some important basics about variables, I want you to practice what we learned up to this point. And I want you to take this 32 value, this number, and store it in a variable instead of using it here in the place where we need it. Instead, store it in a variable at the beginning of our script and then use that variable down here. Maybe also we'll use two alerts that then work with that variable to make adding that variable a bit more useful. Now, one important hint, which you will now that we covered some important basics about variables, I want you to practice what we learned up to this point. And I want you to take this 32 value, this number, and store it in a variable instead of using it here in the place where we need it. Instead, store it in a variable at the beginning of our script and then use that variable down here. Maybe also we'll use 2 alerts that then work with that variable to make adding that variable a bit more useful. Now, one important hint which you will need for creating this variable, this value 32 could be a age. That might matter for picking a proper variable name. That's my challenge for you. Add this new variable. I'll give you a short pause to pause the video and try this on your own. Thereafter, we'll do this together. So, did you succeed? Let's do this together. We want to create a second variable, and I mentioned that you should add it somewhere at the beginning of this script, though I want to emphasize that you can add variables anywhere in your script. You can add them at the end, in between, and at the beginning. Now, at the end doesn't make sense here since I want to use it in my code. So adding the variable thereafter would not work since the code is executed from top to bottom. Adding it in the middle, or maybe right before I plan on using it, would work, but since my instruction for you was to add it at the beginning of the script, I want to add it here, or maybe after greeting text. Up to you. I will add it right at the top. Now, we did learn that we can now add a new variable with the let keyword. That's what we used before as well. And then we need to pick a name. That name, as you learned, is up to you, but has to follow certain rules and conventions. And which name we choose depends on what that value represents. And here I'm assuming it represents my age. So I will name the variable age. Now that's my name, and the interesting thing about this name, of course, is that unlike greeting text, this has no capital characters inside of it. Because that's not a must-do. It's only a must-do if your variable name actually consists of multiple words. Sometimes you might need that to properly describe the value. In the case of age, the word age is enough to describe that, guess what, a number that represents an age is stored in there. We could, of course, also choose user age instead, and then write it like this, but that's totally optional. It would also be fine though. But here I'll go for age, and then store 32 as a value, and I will also add that semicolon, since that is the style I will use in this course, and that is a style you will see a lot out there in general. And now that this variable was created, we can use it. We can use it here for the alert, and output age by referencing it. So by basically telling JavaScript, and therefore the browser, hey, please show an alert, and the content of the alert should be the value stored in age. That's what we're telling JavaScript here. And of course, we can also output multiple alerts for this age, like this. And if I save that, if I reload this page, I get, hi, I'm Max, twice, and then the changed text, and then thereafter, I get my age, 32, being output twice. And of course, we could now also change that variable somewhere and assign a new value, again with the equal sign, as we're doing it with greeting text, and that's something you can do, but not something you need to do here. And that's now another variable introduced. Now, as we continue writing JavaScript code, we add more and more code to this HTML file. And that's important to keep in mind. We are still in a HTML file in here. And just as with the CSS code between the style tags earlier in the course, we also don't want to add too much JavaScript code to the HTML file. Instead, the HTML file should stay focused on HTML and should not be bloated with all our script code. Because of course this here is a simple file. It has basically no real HTML content since I want to focus on JavaScript here. But that's not realistic. In reality, we would probably have a lot of HTML content, and then also having a lot of script code in here can make it harder to work with that file and manage this file efficiently. Therefore, instead of having that script code in here, we typically want to outsource that code into a separate file, and that's something we can easily do. We can add a new file here in our project folder, and we can give this file any name of our choice, for example, app.js. The only thing which is not up to you is the file extension. That should be .js, which stands for JavaScript, and since we're going to store some JavaScript code in that file, that's the extension we should use. But the part in front of the extension is up to you. That could be scripts.js or site.js, and here I'll just choose app.js, but it is up to you. Now we can grab our JavaScript code and only the code between the script tags, not including the script tags, just as we did it with the CSS code before as well. We took the CSS code between the style tags, not including the style tags, and then we cut that JavaScript code from the HTML file and paste it into our app.js file. And here I'll press that format document shortcut to quickly format this appropriately and get rid of that extra white space. If I would leave the white space here, the code would still work, but it's harder to read, and therefore here I want to get rid of it. Kind of the opposite of what we had with HTML. There we added indentation to make our code easier to read. With JavaScript, since we have line after line, and not really this nesting, which we have in HTML, we typically don't add redundant white space like this. Though we'll see some use cases for white space later on. Now, as a side note, hitting that format document shortcut did add double quotes here around this first string for me, and it did add those double quotes because I had this escape single quote in there. Keep in mind, what I had here before was this kind of string. And that was valid code, but the prettier extension, which I'm using for formatting here, actually changes this slightly so that we don't have to escape the single quote character anymore, as it wraps this overall string with double quotes. That's an alternative way of doing it, and even though I'm a fan of consistency, that's what the auto-format shortcut does for me here, and we could change the configuration, but we can also just stick to that behavior. I just wanted to highlight it here. But now we got our JavaScript code in here, and in index.html, we can now get rid of these script tags. And now the question just is how we can link this HTML file to this JavaScript file so that this code still is executed in our browser. And you could think that you again use this link element, which we used for style sheets, so for CSS files as well. Maybe we need to add scripts here for the rel attribute. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It would make sense, but it's simply not how HTML works when it comes to linking scripts. And for that, it's always important to keep in mind that HTML is a language with a lot of history. It was not written and invented on one day. Instead, it evolved over many, many years, and new features were added and improved, and that's why we don't have this uniform way of linking to external resources. And for linking to scripts, we therefore indeed again use the script tags, opening and closing. And we use them differently now. Instead of putting our script code between those tags, we now add the src attribute here. So this source attribute, not ref, but source, as we did it on the image. And then here we specify a path to the JavaScript file we want to include here. And that can be a URL, a link to an external server with some exposed JavaScript file, or, like we have it in this case, to a local file, which is in our project directory. And here it's app.js, so I'll just point at this file, including the file extension here. With that, we are telling the browser to link, to import this JavaScript file and to load that JavaScript code and also execute it. Now, one thing's very important here. Even though we have no code between the opening and closing script tag, it's not allowed to use this as a void element. So removing the closing script tag is not allowed, as you can already tell by the errors I'm getting here in my IDE. You have to have that closing script tag. And you also should not add any JavaScript code if you have that source attribute and you are linking to an external file. If you want to use code between the script tags, you should not add the source attribute. But here, of course, I don't want to write code between the script tags. I want to link to that external JavaScript file instead, and that's now how we can do that. If we save all of this, we again get these alerts, which we got before as well, but now through that external JavaScript file. So now we know how to work with values and variables. Even though we're not yet in the position to do really useful things with those features, we know about them, and these will be the core building blocks we need to then do more useful things later. Now, up to this point, we always worked with strings and numbers, and these are super crucial values which we need all the time. But there are other useful values as well. For example, so-called arrays, which are lists of values. And let me give you an example. Let's assume we are dealing with some user input here. And I'll actually delete all that code and write some new code. we are dealing with some user input, and we get a age, as we did it before. We get a username, which maybe is Max. And now we also get some hobbies. We get some hobbies entered through some form, let's say, and we want to store that entered data in a variable so that we can later output it, change it, do whatever we need to do with it. Now, hobbies, as the name suggests, is not just a single value, but multiple values. Now, we could, of course, create multiple variables, like hobby1 and hobby2, and then store different values in different variables. But that has a couple of disadvantages. For one, we don't know in advance how many hobbies a user of our website might be entering. So we don't know, as a developer, how many variables we need to create in advance. In addition, even if we would know it, we have a lot of variables which actually are kind of connected. And that's why we have this special array value. We create an array in JavaScript by using square brackets, opening and closing square brackets. And that creates a so-called array value. And in this array, we can store a list of values, so multiple values, which are kind of connected, you could say, stored in one variable. For example, multiple strings here, like sports and cooking and reading. And as you can see, you separate these different values, these different array elements, with a comma. The white space here, the blank, is optional. I just added it for readability purposes. It's technically not required. The comma is technically required. It's part of the JavaScript array syntax, and it tells JavaScript where one value ends and a new value begins, so to say. So now with that, we created an array with 3 elements separated by commas. And here I have 3 strings. We could also have numbers or numbers and strings mixed. That's all allowed. Depending on what you're storing, you might need different values in here. In this case, I need 3 strings. Now we have the convenience of having connected values stored in one variable. And we will also be able to dynamically add or remove values to and from this array, but that's a little bit more advanced, so we're going to see that later in this course. What we can already do, though, is output one of those array values. Maybe again with the alert command, since at the moment that's the only command we know for outputting something. And we can, for example, output the entire hobbies array by just pointing at hobbies here, just as we before did it with our text and our age. If I save that and I reload this page, I just get this array being output here. By the way, if you're still seeing some old alerts from before, just close them by clicking OK and then reload the page thereafter. And now here I see my array data, sports, cooking, reading. So, conveniently, Alert even knows how to deal with an array, and it also outputs that array data. But sometimes we just need a single item from an array, no matter if it's for outputting it, for alerting it, or for something else. And therefore, we also have a special syntax for pointing at a specific single item in an array. In the place where we want to access a single item, we add square brackets after the variable name, just like this, directly after the variable name. And then here, the square brackets will not create a new array. That would only be the case after the equal sign here. Instead, in conjunction with that variable that stores an array, we can now put the so-called index number, the identifier of one of these array items, between those square brackets to point at a specific item. And for that, it's important to know that in JavaScript, and actually in most programming languages, the items in such an array automatically receive an index number behind the scenes, and every item has its own unique number. And that index simply starts at 0 for the first item, though that's important. 0, not 1 for the first item, 1 for the second, 2 for the third, and so on. These are our index numbers. And hence here, if I want to output the first item from that array, I put 0 between those square brackets, since that index starts at 0 and the first item in the array has that index 0 therefore. That's the identifier of this first item in this array. And if I save this now, and this page reloads, I see sports, which is my first array item. And that's how we can work with arrays. A very useful kind of value for connecting multiple values and storing them in one and the same variable. Arrays are a very useful data type, a very useful kind of value for storing related data that can be expressed as a list of data. Basically just as we had lists in HTML, you could say, for outputting related list data. Sometimes we also have other kinds of related data, which is not just a list, but which is related but needs more context. So which is not just a list of equal values, these are all hobbies after all, but instead multiple connected values that describe different things. Sounds very abstract? Let's consider a passport or an ID.
What the
This
fuck?
here, for example, is the German ID, but you have something like this for every country in the world, I would assume. And the interesting thing here is that this, of course, describes related data in the end, but we have labels that tell us which piece of data describes which trait of this person. So, for example, we have a label for the name, and then we have the value, the actual name of this person. The last name and the first name, we have the date of birth, and so on. And we always have these labels, and then the values for these labels. And overall, of course, we can clearly say that this is related data. All these different pieces of data describe one person. But it's not a list of data, because it's not the same kind of data. We have names, dates, countries, cities, different kinds of data on there. So it's not the same as a list of hobbies. And to describe such kind of data as well in JavaScript, we have another important data type, another important value we can create. And that would be objects. Let's say our user who visits this website has a job. But a job is not just a string where we say developer, for example. But instead, the job could be a combination of different values where we have the name of the company, the place where he or she works, and so on. And for that, we could create such an object. We do that with curly braces after this equal sign here. So opening and closing curly brace. And between those curly braces, we now put the different properties of this object, the different labels and their values that make up this overall object. And we call these label-value combinations properties in the context of such an object in JavaScript. And these labels are up to us. And we could say that a job is described by a title and then maybe the place where this job is being done. And therefore we could add two labels here, a title label and then separated by a comma, our place label. And again, these labels are up to you. You can use any labels you want. Now the labels on their own are not that useful though. If we have a look at our passport again, we did not just have the labels there, but also values for those labels. And values are now assigned not with an equal sign, but by a colon after our labels. And then after that colon, before you have that comma, and then the next label, you have the value for that label. And values for labels inside of an object can again be all those values you already learned about. Strings, numbers, arrays, even other objects, so-called nested objects. But that's something we'll explore later. So here our title could be a string, and that could be developer, for example. And then place also needs a value, so we add a colon, and then, again, a value that makes sense here, so that could again be a string, and it's maybe New York. Maybe a job also has a salary, and that could be a number. Let's say 50,000 US dollars per year, or anything like that. That could be a job, a rich object where multiple pieces of data are grouped together. Now we could also use free individual variables. We could create a variable job title that stores developer, and create another variable job place that stores New York, and create yet another variable job salary that stores the 50,000. We could use these free variables instead of this job object. We could work with those variables in our subsequent code as well. But if we use free individual variables instead of one object, then we as a developer always have to kind of keep in mind that these free variables are logically related. And that might be easy to do, especially in a simple script like this, But it's even easier if you group them together explicitly by creating such an object, just as we created an array for multiple connected list items instead of working with multiple variables. And that's why here I will not create 3 individual variables, but instead one object that has these different properties. By the way, you can of course think about these properties as variables that are scoped, that belong to one object. You don't have the let keyword here though, you just directly have the label name and then the value, and you assign that with a colon instead of an equal sign. But other than that, it's basically like variables that are closed into that object, so to say. So that's how we can create objects. Now, the bigger your objects get, the harder it can get to fully read and understand them if you're looking at code like this. And that's why typically we split objects and their properties across multiple lines. After the opening curly brace, we often add a line break to have the first key value pair. The label is our key, and then this is the value. And after the comma, if we have another property, we add another line break. And again, and then another one in front of the closing curly brace. This is a bit easier to read. And here you now see that some white space was added automatically by my IDE. It's not required technically, we could remove it, and the code works either way, but of course it is a bit easier to read if we do have that white space. And if you want to re-add it, you can simply hit the tab button and it will automatically indent it a bit, or that format document button or shortcut, which also will automatically format this. And that's now simply a bit easier to read. You could also add line breaks like this for arrays if you wanted to, if that helps you with readability. And there it also makes sense if this would be a longer array, but for this array, I think having it in one line is okay as well. But you could add those line breaks as well. Now, when it comes to adding line breaks and splitting code across multiple lines, there also are a couple of other rules which are worth keeping in mind. For example, inside of a string, so between those quotes, you are not allowed to add a line break. You see I'm getting an error here in my IDE if I try to do that. If you would have a longer text and you want to split it across multiple lines, there are 2 main ways of doing that. You can either add a plus here, which actually will add another string to the first one. It will combine 2 strings together, so you can use plus not just with numbers but also with strings. And then you could have your other string in a new line, and that would work, because JavaScript would understand that it should look for another value that belongs to this operation in the next line. So that would work. Things together, so you can use plus. There are 2 main ways of doing that. For example, inside of a string, so between those quotes, you are not allowed to add a line break. You see I'm getting an error here in my IDE if I try to do that. If you would have a longer text and you want to split it across multiple lines, there are 2 main ways of doing that. You can either add a plus here, which actually will add another string to the first one. It will combine 2 strings together, so you can use plus not just with numbers but also with strings. And then you could have your other string in a new line, and that would work, because JavaScript would understand that it should look for another value that belongs to this operation in the next line. So that would work. You could even write it like this, and it would still work. That is all valid JavaScript, though typically you would not write it like this, because that's not super obvious that this belongs together. But you can split longer strings like this. Alternatively, you can also use backticks instead of single quotes. It looks similar, but it's a different character on your keyboard. And if you use such backticks, then you can actually add a line break inside of the string. So that would be an alternative for longer text. Here I will go back to single quotes, since those are also easier to reach for me on the keyboard and are more commonly used, but these backticks can actually help you if you need such a line break inside of the string. Now, throughout the course, you will also see some other line breaks here and there, and you will see how I structure my code. I will also typically explain why something is structured in a certain way, but in general, as a developer, especially in JavaScript code, but also in HTML code, where we also work with indentation and new lines, our goal is always code readability. We always want to write our code, no matter which kind of code it is, such that it's easy to read, that it's easy to grasp, and we don't need to check if there are multiple statements in one and the same line, but instead we go for short lines, concise code, and clearly structured code. And that's therefore also what we'll go for in this course and what we'll teach you in this course. So now that we created this object and we understand how we can add line breaks, how can we work with this object? For the array, we could either use the entire array or point at individual items by using their index. For objects, it's not that different. If we want to output the job title, let's say, then we again use the variable name, job, but now we can add a dot here. Let me zoom out a bit so that I don't have this overlapping overlay. If we add a dot here, we should get auto-completion. If you don't get it, you can manually trigger it with Control Space. You need to type that dot first, though. This dot is a special syntax which we can use in JavaScript to access the different properties of our object. And here we can see that the IDE, Visual Studio Code, automatically suggests these three properties. It also suggests a couple of other things, but these are just some guesses it makes, which are not directly related to this object and which actually won't work. We can see that these three suggestions are the actual properties of this object by this blue box here in front of them. That's how we can identify those suggestions. And now if we want to output the title here, we can simply select it here in the dropdown and hit tab and simply alert job.title. And with this, if we save this, if I reload, I first of all get sports, and then thereafter, developer. So that works, and that's how we can work with objects and their properties in our code. And objects are enough. And then thereafter, developer. Save this. And with this, if we save this,
Oh, okay. I was about to say, what the fuck?
With this, if we save this, if I reload, I first of all get sports, and then thereafter, developer. So that works, and that's how we can work with objects and their properties in our code. And objects are another important value type which we'll work with quite a bit when writing JavaScript code. With numbers, strings, arrays, and objects, we now got 4 super important types of values that you will use a lot.
When Barbara switched to TurboTax,
I broke 4 generations of family tradition with 5 little...
I picked the software engineering program because they pay very well. It's a fast-paced industry. The boot camp allowed me to keep my job, honestly, and continue working. My end goal was to be able to live in a cool city and have enough money to do fun things and enjoy my life, and I just didn't see any of that in the career I was in. I have
a lot in JavaScript programming. Now let's build up on that knowledge. And one thing we haven't done too much, or actually not at all up to this point, is work with those values. Sure, we use the alert command to output them, but very often you want to do calculations, transformations, you want to do operations like that with your data. And therefore I now want to explore some important basics related to that with you now. For this, I'll delete these two alert lines here, and now let's say we want to derive for how many years this user, which we are describing here, is an adult, assuming that you become an adult once you reach 18 years. Now, for that, we could add a new variable that stores our result of that calculation, which we could name adult years. Again, the name is up to you as long as you follow the rules and the convention, but the name, of course, also should convey some meaning and describe the value which you will store in this variable. And here I plan on storing the number of years for which this person here already is an adult. Now, the interesting thing here now is that now I don't want to hard code a new value. Of course, I could store 14 in there because I quickly calculated in my head that 32 minus 18 is 14, but that's not the idea here. This input here could be coming from a user through a form. So even though we did hard code it here as a developer for demo purposes, this value, 32, might actually not really be known by us, the developer. And therefore we want to derive the adult years dynamically. We want to calculate them. Also, of course, to avoid the fact that we make an error whilst doing that math in our head. So therefore, instead of just writing 14 here, I instead want to use my age, which stores the 32, and now deduct 18 from that age. And you can do all those basic math operations which you know in JavaScript as well. You can deduct something by adding the minus symbol and then the value you want to deduct, 18 in this case. And now adult years will store the result of this operation. And of course, this could also be a longer operation with multiple steps. So you're not just allowed to deduct one value from another, but you can add as many steps here as you want. Of course, you're also not limited to subtraction. You can also add values with the plus symbol, multiply values with the asterisk symbol, and divide by values with the forward slash. But here we need the subtraction, and now adult years should store the result of age, which in this case is 32, minus 18. And I will again alert this here. I will alert adult years. Save that. And on my website, I therefore get 14 here in this alert box. So that's working. And that's important. This might sound obvious, and if it is, great. But this is a key thing in programming in general. That you can, of course, not just use variables to store values so that you can then output them, but that you can also work with values and do mathematical or other operations on them to derive new values with which you then might do something. Like in this case, outputting that new value again. I also want to mention again that variables are called variables because the values stored in them are allowed to change. And at the moment, that's never the case. We always assign a value, and then we leave it like that. You can also reassign variables. You're not limited to that initial value. So, for example, if the age would change for some reason, you can again reference age and assign a new value by adding the equal sign again. And then you could store a value of, let's say, 45 here. Now, the important thing here for that is that you don't add the let keyword again, though. You don't do that. You only add the let keyword when you first create and introduce a variable. Here, I did already create and introduce that variable, and I'm then just assigning a new value, and that is then done without let. You only need let if you introduce a new variable with a new name. So here, for example, we need let. We are using age again, but only on the right side of the equal sign for this calculation. The variable which we create, adult years, is brand new. Here for age, on the other hand, we are using an existing variable, so we don't need let. And now that I did change age here, what do you think is the result of adult years now? Is it still 14? Because it'd be 27 minus 8. And save that. and it reloads, I see 27. So it's the result of 45 minus 18. And that should make a lot of sense, because instructions are executed step by step, line by line, and therefore we did change age before we use it in this calculation, and hence the new value of age is used, not the old value. That wouldn't make too much sense. So therefore in this demo script, we now never use the original age of 32, we only use the new one. And of course we're still just playing around with these features here to get a feeling for what we... Now let's build up on what we learned up to this point. We are calculating our adult years here by deducting 18 from the age. Now we can actually switch the order here and do that before I reassign the age, and then thereafter calculate the new adult years, which is age minus 18 again. So now I'm doing the same thing twice, but I do it for the different age values, because in between I do assign a new age value. Now I'm still only outputting adult years once down there though. Hence if I do that and save this, if this reloads, I still only see 27 because I never alert adult years before I recalculate it. But of course we could do that. We could also alert it here and then reassign the age and recalculate adult years. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm sometimes adding an empty line, this is totally optional, not required. I'm just doing it for readability purposes to make my code a bit easier to read. You don't have to add those blank lines. But back to our code. I did now also alert adult years here, and hence of course we now see 14 and then 27. Now why am I showing this here? Because now we again have some code duplication. We are repeating the same step in two different places. And do you see which step I'm talking about, which operation I'm talking about? I'm talking about the calculation here where we are deriving adult years. Now, of course, we are also repeating this alert code here, for example, but there is an important difference. For alert, we are just executing one command which is built into the browser. For this operation here, for this calculation, we basically built our own very simple algorithm. We have a clearly defined operation that executes certain steps. In this case, one key step where we deduct 18 from age. But if this operation would change, if I for some reason need to add these values instead of subtract them, then we have to do this in two places. And we typically want to avoid scenarios like this as a developer. We want to be lazy, as it's sometimes called. We don't want to do the same work in different places. Because if we ever decide that the correct operation would be to use a plus here to add these two values, then we have to search our entire code for other occurrences of this operation and make the changes there as well, which is annoying and error-prone. We can, for example, easily overlook one of the places where adjustments would be needed if we have complex code. That's why we typically want to put our own operations into our own clearly defined commands which have their own name and which we can then reuse by just using that name, so to say, instead of repeating the entire operation code all the time. So basically like it's working for the built-in alert. Here we always repeat the same command which has the same name. And adding errors here is way harder because we get auto-completion for that name and so on. And hence, this is a great way of reusing logic, the logic for outputting this alert box with some content. Here, we now also want to write our own command. And that's called a function. Functions are a key. Now let's build up on what are a key feature of programming, not just of JavaScript. And functions are basically our own commands which we can define as a developer to then execute them anywhere in our code. And now it's time for our own custom function here. For this, anywhere in your code, you can add a new function by typing the function keyword. So we saw the let keyword for defining variables, now we have the function keyword for defining functions. Why is it let and not variable? Well, it is what it is. So here we have the function keyword, and as I said, with that we can create our own command. Hence the next step is to give our own command a name. And that name is totally up to you, it just again has to follow certain rules and conventions, and these rules and conventions are the same as for variable names. However, there is an additional convention that function names should not describe what's in them, but instead what this operation does, since a function is a command that you can later reuse to perform a certain operation. Hence, function names should describe this operation. So here, I want to calculate my adult years, and hence I'll name this function calculate adult years. Now, this naming might still be a bit strange if you have never worked in programming before, but it is something you will get used to. Now, that's the name of our own function, our own command. Now, things change a bit though. We don't use the equal sign, as we did it for variables. Instead, for functions, we now add opening and closing parentheses, and then curly braces. Opening and closing curly braces. And now between those curly braces, we put our operation code. So the code that makes up this operation. And we can also put something between those parentheses here, but I'll come back to that later. Now typically, you do now add a new line. So you add a line break, and you indent this here a little bit for readability's sake. You don't have to. You can write it all in one line. You also don't have to indent, but it's the common notation to use multiple lines and to indent, because that will make it more readable. And in here, you can now perform the operation which you want to outsource. In my case, that's this calculation where I deduct 18 from age. Now, for this, we can copy this code and add it in this function. And now we need to do something with it here. Because like this, we perform this operation, but out of the box, this just produces a new value, which at the moment would go into the void. Now, one thing we could do here is we could store this in adult years, however, not by using let here, but without let, and actually define this adult years variable before we define this function. Maybe like that. This without an initial value. Which is also allowed. And then here, down there, I just assign a new value and hence I remove let. Now I'll come back to why I'm doing this in a second. But for the moment, let's change our code like this. Now this function, this custom command, overwrites, sets a new value to adult years, and the new value is age minus 18. So what I'm also doing down there. Now the interesting thing about functions is that actually by defining such a function here, as we're doing it here between lines 12 and 14, does not execute the code in that function yet. When this entire JavaScript code file is being parsed and executed by the browser, once the browser reaches this line, and this entire code block, therefore, it will just memorize this function. It will learn your own custom command, so to say, but it will not execute it yet. Instead, you as a developer now have to tell the browser when this function should be executed. And we could do this here, instead of performing that operation of which I wanted to get rid of, as mentioned. And to execute a function, you repeat its name, so calculate adult years in my case, and then you add parentheses, opening and closing thereafter. And that's some syntax which might look familiar to you, because that's what we're basically doing for the alert, for this built-in command, which turns out to be a built-in function provided to you automatically by JavaScript and the browser. Here we also have a variable between those opening and closing parentheses, but I'll come back to why we have it here and not here later. For the moment here, for calculate adult years, we don't need it. And now we can also calculate adult years here instead of that operation which we had before. And now the advantage of this is that we only have this operation once in our function, and here I should also add a semicolon, and then we just call this function in the different places where we want to perform this operation. And hence, if we ever, for whatever reason, need to change the logic in this operation here, we can do it in this function instead of searching for all the different places in our code where we used this operation. Here, of course, I want to stick to the deduction though. And with all of that, if we save this and reload, we still see 14 and 27 as we did it before. But now we're utilizing our own function, our own command, for writing that code once and then using it multiple times in different parts of our code. And that's the key benefit of functions. I also like to call them code on demand. We can define code which is not executed immediately, but which we instead trigger in different parts of our code when we need that code to run. So that's functions. There is way more to functions than what we used up to this point. For example, you might wonder, why did I move adult years up here and so on? Now I did that because, of course, ultimately I deleted adult years down there and replaced it with my function call. But why am I not just creating adult years here in the function, like this? Now I deleted the adult years definition outside of the function, and I'm just defining it in there. Well, let's give this a try.
No.
Give this a try. If we save this code, and you reload your page, you might still be getting old alerts, but if you click them away and you reload again, you will not get alerts again. And if you open the developer tools and go to the console there, you will see an error. And you should always check that console if something does not work as expected, because errors thrown by your JavaScript code will be output here in the developer tools in that console. And here we get an uncaught reference error. Adult years is not defined. That's a weird one. I mean, we are defining it here. Well, that's already a bit advanced, but it is an important concept. Here, we are creating a variable, but if you create a variable inside of a function, it's only usable in there. And that's also why it's slightly grayed out. That's Visual Studio Code's way of signaling to you that this variable is never getting used anywhere else in your code. You might be saying, we are using it down there. Yes, but that's not the same variable, because as I just said, using let inside of a function creates a new variable, which is only usable in that function. And in that function, we never use it, which is why it's grayed out. We only assign a value, but then we never do anything else with it in there. And when we try to use it down there, we just don't find it, because outside of this function, we're never creating an adult years variable. And before I made that change, we did do that. So if I do add adult years here, like this, even without an initial value, then we do define it outside of this function again. But now I still have a difference compared to the code from before. Now I still have the let keyword inside of this function. And that still has an important implication. If we save this code again, even though I added this variable outside of this function, if I reload this page, I get my alerts again here, but they show undefined now. So I'm not getting an error anymore, but also not the expected results. And the reason for that is that we're still creating a custom variable inside of this function, even though it has the same name as the variable outside of the function. This is something which is allowed in JavaScript. It's called variable shadowing, and it simply means that in functions, you can overwrite variables from outside of functions. You can create new variables with the same name, and that will leave the outside variables intact. It will not delete them or change them. It will just create an additional variable of the same name, which is only usable inside of this function. And we then assign our calculated value to this internal variable, and hence that external variable, which is not defined in the function, never receives that value. Only if we remove let here inside of the function, we again tell JavaScript to please assign that value to this variable, which is not defined in this function, but which is defined outside of this function. And that is something which we can do. That is what we did before, and that's how we now ensure again that adult years is accessible and changeable inside of the function, but then also accessible outside of it. So now we got some key basics about functions, but we're still not done, because this function is still not ideal, still not perfect. It works, but we have a couple of bad practices in there, which we don't typically want to do. I did explain why we can't change adult years if our code looks like this. But maybe you got the feeling over the last lecture that that's a lot to memorize. And it is. And sometimes you need this behavior which I described, that you can shadow variables, and that you don't want to do it in other scenarios, but you can also make life easier for you. It would be best if this function doesn't even have to know about the variable name of our outside variable here, if it could work standalone. Because at the moment, if I ever change this from adult years to, let's say, total adult years, I have to change this name down here, and also inside of the function. And again, because this is a simple script that's not too difficult, but you always have to keep in mind that ultimately you will write more complex code, and then having to make changes in dozens of places, maybe even across multiple JavaScript files, is very annoying. So therefore it would be better if this function wouldn't even have to know this external variable name. And indeed, that is something you typically want to strive for, that your functions work without knowing external variable names. And when it comes to deriving this result here, this result of this calculation, what we can do in a function is we can return the result of a calculation with the special return keyword. Now, what does returning a value mean? It means that this function does now not just perform a certain operation, or possibly multiple steps. You can have multiple lines of code in there, that would be fine. But that instead, when you call that function, you now get a value from calling that function. So before, this function, without the return keyword, didn't return anything. Calling that function doesn't produce a new value. Now with the return statement, calling that function does produce a new value, and calling that function does return this result. Hence, we can work with that result here in the line of code where we called this function, and we can, for example, store it in a variable again. In total adult years, for example. Here we can store the result of calling that function. Now, of course, that still means we're using that variable name down there, and if we would change it, we have to change it in these places down there. But it's very often the case that you store functions. Like this in separate files, and then you at least don't have to dive into those files as well to make such variable name changes. And in your main file, where you are using a variable in different places in your code, you can always use the search and replace feature of your IDE, of Visual Studio Code, to quickly change the name in all the places where it needs to be changed. So this typically is a better way of doing it than what we did before. And in addition, and even more importantly than this we don't have to change the name everywhere thing, we now also made a huge step towards making our function more reusable, more flexible. Before we returned, we always stored the result of our calculation in total adult years inside of that function. And that means that if we ever would want to use this function in a different place of our code and store the result in a different variable, it just wouldn't work as long as we directly reference total adult years from inside this function. Now with the return statement, that changed. Now we can use this function anywhere in our code and in the place where we use it. So in the place where we call this function, we can then decide where the result should be stored. And that is a huge benefit of using the return statement instead of directly accessing a variable in the function and storing our value there, because now our function is more reusable and more flexible, even though that's not something we utilize or need for this simple demo here. But it is something you typically want to go for when you write code, because ultimately it will make your life as a developer easier. We also, of course, want to do that down here, where I call calculate adult years again. Because we now need to store that returned value, otherwise that returned value goes into the void and we won't be able to work with it. Now, if I save this again, I again get these alerts with 14 and 27. Let me close this and reload to make it a bit easier to read. And that's a great step forward and a very important feature. Functions don't have to return a value. For example, alert here doesn't return a value. We're not storing this anywhere, but they often do. And especially if you have a function that performs a certain mathematical operation, it's very common that you do want to return so that the result of this operation then can be stored in different variables in your code. Now, because we are returning a value now, we're now a bit more independent when it comes to that total adult years variable. But there still is another external variable which we are using in calculate adult years, and that would be this age. This is still a variable which we define outside of this function and then redefine here. And again, we typically want to avoid referencing and using such external variables here. Now, in case of the result which we derived, we could solve the problem by returning. But what can we do in case of some input value which we're using? For this use case, we have a feature called function parameters. Function parameters are basically inputs we can accept in a function. And for those, we need those parentheses here directly after the function name. Here, we can accept parameters, and we can give those parameters any name of our choice. And we can use as many as we need. Now here, I'm only interested in the age, and to avoid name duplication, even though it technically would be allowed, but to avoid confusion, I'll choose a different name here. I'll name it user age. It's like defining a variable, but without the let keyword, but following the same naming conventions as we had them for variables. So this name is up to you, but should follow those rules and conventions. This is now a parameter of this function, and inside of this function code, so between these curly braces, it acts as a variable that's only accessible inside of this function. So not outside of this function. We can't use user age here. That won't work. It's only available inside of this function. And we can now use that in our calculation instead of age. We can use user age. Now, like that, it would not work though. Instead, now that we added this parameter, when we call the function, we have to pass a value for that parameter. And maybe you're already guessing it, that's what we do between the parentheses here when we call a function. That's also what we're doing for alert already. Alert is a built-in function provided by the browser that takes a parameter actually. And we're passing in a value for that parameter here, in that case the value which we want to output in the alert. In case of our own function, we also want such a parameter, and we want a parameter that we use in this mathematical calculation, so we want the age of the user. And therefore here, when we call calculate adult years, we can of course just pass in a value, which we create on the fly, so to say, or we use an existing variable like age here.
I get it.
This age variable which I create up here, I can use that down there as well and pass that value in.
Okay, so yeah, yep. User age. So with calling this function here, the variable age, which is 32, goes into the user age parameter, which is down here. So this would just be age minus, and then this should just work. Yeah, 14.
To this function when we execute this function. And here we also pass an age. And that's the great thing about functions and why they are so useful, especially if you do use parameters and return values. Now we define our general code once, but it's pretty flexible. We can call this function with different values for age, as we're doing it here. The value of age changes between these two function calls, and we'll get back different results. Our general logic, our algorithm, is always the same. But the concrete values change because we're using this parameter value here. Now, of course, you can only pass in a value for this parameter that makes sense for this function. So, for example, passing in a text like hi there doesn't make a lot of sense. Hi there minus 18, which is the operation that would be performed, doesn't lead to anything useful. But since you are the one writing your functions and you're the one calling your functions, or if you're working in a team, you are passing on the information on how this function should be used, you of course know how to call it, and that in this case we should pass in a number, for example the number stored in our age variable. And with all of that, if we save this and it reloads, we again get these alert boxes with 14 and 27. Now this function only needs one parameter. If we would need multiple parameters, and other functions could need multiple parameters, for example in an upcoming exercise for you will have a function with multiple parameters, then you can separate them with commas. So that would be another parameter here, separated by a comma. The names are always up to you, but you have to separate them with commas. Now here we don't need it, but it is something you should know, because you will definitely also sometimes write functions that do need more than one parameter. And now with that, we are using all those amazing function features you should know about. Over the last lectures, I spent a lot of time on functions, because functions are a super crucial and key feature which you will need all the time in JavaScript development, and that's why you need to understand them. And I hope I could explain those key basics. We are going to write and use a lot of functions throughout this course, so you will get a lot of practice, but the general idea should be clear by now. I want to emphasize again that functions don't need to return and don't need to take parameters. It will depend on which kind of function you're writing and what it's doing. I also want to emphasize again that functions, of course, can execute multiple steps in there. And you can, of course, also introduce variables in there, like result, which then are only available in this function. And then here we could store user age minus 18 in result and return the value stored in result here. That would be an alternative way of writing this function. Arguably an unnecessarily complex way, but to understand that you can do all these things in functions, I want to switch to that code for now. So which code goes into a function, and whether you return and/or whether you use parameters depends on what your function does. As I said, we're going to write many functions throughout this course, and therefore there will be plenty of opportunities to practice this. This is the general feature of functions. That's how it generally works. And now let's build up on that. It's now time to practice what we learned. And for that attached, you find this exercise.js file, which is a brand new JavaScript file, which you can add to your project folder by dragging and dropping it in there. And in that file, I got some instructions for you. As a side note, these are all JavaScript comments. You add them by adding 2 forward slashes. And anything you write thereafter will not be interpreted as a command, but instead is just an annotation for you or other developers. But now let's move on to your concrete tasks. As you can see, I got a couple of tasks here, and the first task is that you create 3 new variables. One variable that stores the name of an online course of your choice, another variable that stores the price of that course, and a third variable that actually stores the 3 main goals that you might have when taking that course. So create these 3 variables and assign any values of your choice. Of course, think about the value types which you plan on using. Now, once you completed the first task, take these variables and output, alert them, as we also did it before in this section. Now, in the third task, you will need to apply more of the things we learned. I now want you to group these variables together. And we did learn about a certain way of grouping related data together. So try grouping them together here, give them proper names, proper labels, and then once you did that, also still output their values. You can still use the alert function for that, but you will have to access your different values slightly differently than you did it before in steps 1 and 2. Now in step 4, in task number 4, I want you to also output the second element in your main goals variable. Now in task number 5, you should define your own command, your own custom command, with any name of your choice, that actually will use that main goals variable and access an element by its identifier. So basically what we did in task number 4. But unlike in task number 4, this custom command should now be a bit more flexible. The concrete identifier which you access should be dynamic. There should be some way of providing a value when that custom command is executed. And you should then be able to execute the same command for different identifiers. The main goals variable also should be dynamic inside of that command code. This command should not just work with main goals, but actually with any list of values. And last but not least, this custom command should then, when you execute it, provide the accessed value so that in the place where you did execute the custom command, you can use that accessed value, so that list element which was retrieved by that custom command. Now, step number 6, or task number 6, is to then use this custom command which you did define in task number 5 and output, alert the result, 4 different values, different lists maybe, and different identifiers of list items of your choice. At least execute it once, but feel free to execute it more than once. Now, these are my tasks for you. You can put your solution code right into this exercise.js file. You should just make sure that this exercise.js file is then also being used in index.html. You see, maybe instead of app.js or in addition, that's up to you. And definitely try this exercise on your own first. In the solution video, I will show you my solution, and I do recommend that you go through that video also to compare your solution, and also if you get stuck and you're not sure how to
name. Of course. These. Alright.